Okay, I think I'm back up. Wait for all of the streams to connect real fast. Okay, here we go. Looks like I'm back up. So thank you guys for your patience on that. First time I've ever had a crash on the stream. So I'm gonna go ahead and open up the saved version of this so we can kind of get back into place. Gonna delete our layer here, and so we're back to kind of where we were before. Now that we've got our normal map and everything saved, we can jump over into our layers and we can go ahead and add our texture. Now in this case, I'm not going to be exporting any of the regular maps from Substance, so I just am worried about the paint layer that I'm working on. And so I'm going to start by creating a fill layer, and I'm going to change this down to a sort of black color. And then I want to take down the glossiness here. So we'll drop this. This is going to be the tarnish. Something like that. And then I want to mask this out back onto the default material. So we'll jump over to Smart Masks. And now if we take a look at these, what I used before was, I believe, dust occlusion. So we'll drop that on our fill layer. And now if we select the dirt mask, we can crank up this dirt level and the contrast here. And that will allow us to get in here and play with these settings. Now you're gonna have to, tweak these a little bit to get these lined up correctly. But this is basically all I did. So before we continue, let me check some of my settings real fast and just make sure we're still good to go on all of these areas. So I need to quickly do some maintenance to reestablish the stream connection. So let me do that really quickly. Never had the stream go down, so. All right. So all we need to do now that we have our map in place, we can paint on top of this. If we want to add a paint layer, basically now we can go in and with our tablets, we can paint using black and white values. So if we look at our brush settings here, we have this color. This can be switched from white to black, or if you use X on your keyboard, just like in Photoshop, you can change the value there. So if you grab your brushes, something like this, then we'll lower the size. And by switching this to a dark color, we can paint out things. Switching it to a white color, we can paint things in. And so you can see how we can kind of manually tweak our dirt and our tarnish and all that sort of stuff, especially where there's seams right here. It can help to kind of clean those up a little bit and just kind of get in here manually and fix things. So once we have that done to our satisfaction, all we have to do is right click and go to export mask to file. And in this case, I saved it as a tarnish map and a PNG. So that's the whole process. And then I'll show you how to connect that up in Blender. So if we jump back over into Blender here, let me open this up. I will grab the scene. Get my tablet out of the way real fast. Okay, so let's grab the spoon here now. And obviously I re-imported the new spoon with the proper UVs and all of that and put that into place so that it is all the same object. And so what I did to add this tarnish on top, if we zoom into the spoon here, I'll start rendering this so you can see how this looks. Give it a few moments to update here. Okay, so let's optimize the selection real fast. Speed this up a little bit. Okay, so if we look at the original material, you can see basically we just have a diffuse material and a glossy. And for any basic metal, you would have a pretty dark diffuse plugged into a mix with a glossy on top of it. And then I'm using a basic Fresnel to drive the way the reflections are mixed together. And then of course we have our normal map plugged in here. So then to add the tarnish on top, all I did was open up the tarnish image file, and I brought that in and used it as a black and white mask for the factor in our new mix shader. And then for the tarnish, I just created a sort of black diffuse material. And in fact, we'd probably want to raise this value up a little bit so the tarnish was more visible in those cracks instead of just pure black. And the roughness, we might even want to go up higher, like a 0.8 for making it non-reflective and all of that sort of stuff. And so we can now preview this again, and you'll see the tarnish now driven by that image. So there you go. That's all that's needed to add that in there. And that's kind of how I created that. Now you can obviously use the PBR workflow, but like I said, it didn't really work because I already set the scene up using non-PBR shaders that I'm building from scratch. So you would kind of need to stick to one workflow or another as you work through the scene. So, all right, let's move on to what we're going to talk about tonight, which is adding grunge and dirtying up some textures. So let's jump back over to Photoshop. I'll zoom in on our notebook down here. So you can see down here that apart from the original, I went in and added a little bit more dirt, and you got some ink splatters and things happening on the page. And I did all of this in Photoshop, and basically all I had to do was kind of subtly start layering things up. And so we're going to talk about some specifics and how to do that if you've never done it before with Photoshop. So if we take a look at the texture layout, turn my layers back on here. I'm going to expand the layer palette so it's a little easier to see. Like that. So I might go ahead and just close these because I don't really think I'm going to need those. Okay. So let's start turning things off so you can see what things look like. Now the original texture, if I have this black background on, is just a black and white map. So we have a separate shader, part of the cycle shader, driving the ink on top of the page, right? And that's important because I wanted to keep the subtle texture in the page for the bump separate as a procedural shader and cycle, so I didn't have to paint that in. And that way, the only thing we're really working on is what goes on top of the page. So that's our sort of map here as far as the ink goes. So we'll maybe call this ink map. And then I needed to create a version that was sort of this, but gave me a guide for where to paint the dirt and things like that. So if we turn this ink layer on, you can see that basically I just have a black and white image, so I inverted what we already had and created this. And then I wanted to make it feel a little bit more like the sort of parchment paper that we're painting on. So I changed this to multiply, and then I put a colored layer behind this as a fill. And then I started my painting. So I put some ink splatters in here. You can see those popping up around here. After all, with the fountain pen, it's going to be a little bit more unpredictable, especially back in those days. So I grouped that together. And then for the dirt layer, turn that on. And you can see I started with just a very subtle dusting of the entire journal and tried to kind of break it up. So I went in and I painted some big areas, and then I went in and erased some areas so that it looked a little bit more random. Then I went back with a second layer and I kind of changed the color a little bit and added in some more splotches, switched up the brush so that it looked a little different. And on top of that, I went in and added some more dark textures on top of that. And that's kind of where I'm at right now. So if we were to play with this layer a little more, zoom in all the way, you can see just how subtle the texturing effects are here in our layers. And so this area is going to be a little bit more like a dirt smudge that was kind of caked on. Maybe it was some mud or something that dried on the page. And so it's going to be a little bit more opaque instead of the rest of this stuff. And I want to kind of walk through how we're going to make this sort of start to look aged. So we got a pretty good part of that done by just starting to add some subtlety with the dirt on here. But you're going to start noticing as we start aging parts of this project that other parts are really going to start standing out as way too clean and polished and things like that. And so the trick is going to be kind of finding a nice balance between going overboard and not going, not going far enough in some areas. And so let's start playing around here. Now I noticed that as I map this back down, this kind of fell in the crevice here in the binding. And so maybe we want to carry this over to the other page right here. And so if I start continuing to do that, I actually have the UV map right here. So you can see how that falls into the journal right there. If I invert that, you can kind of see that a little better. So we want to kind of continue this over into here and make it look like one continuous smear so that it has a little bit more continuity and feels a little bit more like it was intentional, right? And not maybe CG. So I'm going to start with my tablet, got my paintbrush, and let's just start walking through how to block some of this in. So what I like to do first is kind of start with the smudges and then start layering on top of that. And so we'll just grab a brush, kind of start playing a little bit with the settings up here. So I'm going to go ahead and color pick some of these that we already have here. Maybe just carry this over. I'm using a pretty light touch here. And then I'll be just frequently recolor picking so I can change up the hues as we go. And then I'll change settings like the size of my brush, the brush I have selected, to try to get a bit of texture variation with the way things are going. And it's really easy to get in here and start playing and not really think about what you're doing as you go, but you want to kind of have a plan as you start developing things so that it feels natural. So I'm going to pick the smudge command. Save real fast just in case something happens. Computer feels like it's not want to cooperate tonight. Save that, close Blender. Let's see. Yeah, Photoshop's acting funny. Okay, let me go ahead and kill this real fast. And then we'll just reopen this and make sure this is going to work for us. Okay. Pull this back up. Okay, so it did save, that's good. Let's go ahead and zoom in again. All right, so let's grab the smudge brush here. And there should be, all of these are now kind of expanded. Usually they have little menus behind them, but because I think I rearranged this, it got taller and they're all kind of showing right now. So let's make this a little bigger, and then I just start kind of lowering the strength down to something like 25, Let's pull this a little bit so it feels like it was kind of raked across the page. And then we'll go back and just kind of start painting a little bit here and there as we go. So let's switch this back to painting. Quickly get these back in place. I'm using the brush box extension, which I really like. Okay, there we go. So we'll pick something that looks like it has some nice grit to it, and then kind of play around with how that's coming in. And the trick here is contrast and subtlety. So you want to kind of play with bunching those edges up against each other. So you get hard and soft happening kind of all over the place. And that's kind of the key to making this feel a little bit more realistic here. Also going to raise the opacity so we get back to an area that's a little bit more opaque. And then the key is going to be really making sure we're playing around with these values. So one of the other things I like to do is kind of get in here and kind of add a little bit of an outline. And that just kind of makes it feel a little bit 3D already. Now, typically that's not a good idea because you don't want to add any shadowing information really in on this texture. You want to let cycles kind of take care of that for you, but we're just adding a little bit of break up here. And you can cheat. If you get away with it, you can always say that, you know what you're doing. So here's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be painting this stuff in, and then we're going to be going back and deciding what areas kind of need to be raised. Soften that up, and then we'll do one more pass that has a little bit more texture on it. So I'm going to zoom in even further here so you guys can see this. This is sort of like a tree brush. It's kind of interesting. You can see what that did. It's kind of cool. A little happy accident there. Okay. One more time. That one was a little strong, so let's pull that a little bit. And what we can do if it's a little too strong is go back with our eraser tool. For this, I like to pick something pretty unobtrusive there. It's a little strong, so let's lower the opacity to something like 10%. And we can just kind of move this in and out to where we get some of those edges taken out. Just like that. Now this is really cool because we're gonna actually kind of raise this up as we get into the other textures. So you can see what that did. And that's really all that there is to adding the dirt as far as the color goes. So we'll go ahead and save this, and I'll show you how I applied this in Blender. So I have a separate PSD here. Save this here. Okay. And now I'll kind of show you how I brought this in. So in Blender, remember we already have most of this as far as the page done. So we really just want the dirt itself. So let me make my layers a little bigger so you can see kind of what's going on here. And so we have everything grouped here in terms of the dirt and the ink. And then we want it transparent. So we'll turn that off, leave this transparent. And the ink we don't need because we already have that. So we're gonna turn off the underlay. So we just have the ink splatters that we added. And then we're gonna turn on the dirt. And so we basically have a transparent image with just the dirt showing with the ink splatters. Now we can get a save as, and we're gonna use a transparent PNG. So if we go to this here and we select journal dirt. That's the map that I'm already using. Replace that. PNG should by default, with transparency showing in Photoshop, save it with the transparency alpha. And I'll show you how to check that in Blender. So let's go ahead and wait for this to save. Catch a drink real fast. Okay, I think it's done. I think it just hasn't updated yet. So let's jump back into Blender now. And open up our scene file. Pray for no more crashes tonight. All right. So let's select our journal here. Jump over to all of our materials for this. Make sure we select entry pages. And this one's kind of growing a little large. So let's make this full screen and take a look at what we have. So our regular texture for the journal with the ink and everything ends right here. And if I was to kind of preview this, let's see how this looks. Okay. To anybody who's been in chat, if you've said anything, I probably haven't seen it because I didn't have my chat window refreshed for the new stream, so I apologize for that. But I'm listening, so if you have anything you want to talk about, I'm here. Okay. So let's zoom in even further. Kind of see what's going on here. Okay, so you can see the original texture, and then our journal texture down here is loaded right there. I want to refresh that with Alt-R. And then if we preview this, you can kind of see what that's looking like. And all I've done here is loaded the texture, and it does have the alpha included. And so the alpha is going to go into a mix factor here because it's basically a black and white image. So if we, whoops, let's go ahead and reopen that texture. Didn't mean to do that. Journal dirt, there it is. Okay, so if we were to click the alpha, you can see the black and white image. So everything that's closer to white is going to show up, and everything that is non-existent or darker is going to disappear. And so if we look at our diffuse here, basically we're plugging in the color input, which is this, and then we're mixing that with the black and white mount from the alpha over top of the original material with this mix shader, and there we go. That's all it takes. We've got our dirt layered on top. So let me zoom out a little bit. Let's pick an area to kind of focus on here. Okay, so let's double check our Photoshop document and see if all of our textures are currently coming over. Not sure this was brought over right here. May just not be coming up far enough to be seen. So what I'm going to do is kind of move this over a little bit. So select this here. I'm just going to shift this over a little bit so it looks like one continuous line was kind of smeared through the binding and over that part of the page. And now let's resave this and update it. Okay. Give it a second to save there. So this one's taking a bit more time because it is a 4K texture map. So thank you for your patience, everyone. Looks like we got a comment. Caffeine injected says, looks good. Thanks, man. Appreciate it. check this out now. Okay, so let's grab this right here, Alt-R, reload that. Let's see where that's at. Okay, still not updated. Let's make sure Photoshop's done. It's looking like it's not yet. Okay, now it should be there. So I'm going to turn off the preview and then re-enable it. Okay, yeah, that did it. So you can see it pop up there. Now it's not lined up, so I need to move this up and kind of over a little bit. So let's play with that in Photoshop. And that's just kind of what you do is you work with this stuff until you find something that is working for what you need. So we've got a separate layer here for this. So I'm just going to select all of that, pull that up here. Now they are lined up, so it should be close. So we'll go ahead and really quickly try to resave this, and then I will digress and move on. So anybody in the chat have anything specific they want me to talk about, work on as we're getting into texturing tonight? This is all about helping you guys out. If you got any issues with your textures that you'd like covered, I'm listening and ready to answer any questions. Adding the depth information will actually do quite a bit in terms of the final render, especially the closer we get to the page with the camera. You'll be able to see just really subtle variations, and you'd be surprised how much shows up with you know, fingernail scratches or anything like that on the page. It doesn't take much, and it's there. So if you have a chance to add that sort of stuff to a 3D illustration and it's going to be big enough to be noticed, you know, take the time and do that sort of stuff. Okay, we're gonna prevent, try to avoid going back and forth between Blender and Photoshop as much as possible because it's taking a little too much time. All right, reload, render on. Okay, there we go. So it kind of looks like somebody dropped some mud in there and someone tried to wipe it off or something like that. And that's kind of the idea. Now, this part I actually want to be sort of caked up a little higher. And so one thing I want to do before I do that is make sure that this area is completely sort of opaque, so it's over top of the ink. And then I want to go back and add a little bit of depth in there so that it's, you know, still got a little bit of mud that has dried there. Let's disable the preview. And let's talk about painting that part of the layer. Okay, so both of these right here are sort of the same thing. So I'm going to combine those layers. And we actually have some down here as well that I haven't really been showing. And all of these areas right here, we want to get in here and start adding in some of that depth information. And this is pretty easy to do. So what we need to do is start by just converting this to a black and white map. So I'm going to duplicate this, and just so we can kind of see everything a little bit more clearly, I'm going to turn those layers back on. And now if I hold down Control Shift and U on the copy of that layer, that's going to turn that into a grayscale image. And move this out of this layer here. And now we need to start recreating the image map for our depth map. So because we want to basically only have the dirt raised, we'll start with a middle ground gray. So let's pick a color that is 50% gray. Fill this layer, drop it behind so that that is not raised and not lowered. It's sitting perfectly in the center because that's how the depth map will work. And we're basically going to convert this into a normal map and add that on top of the map that's already sitting there for our displacement. And so what we kind of need to do here is invert what we're looking at, because the darker areas need to be raised. So we'll grab this layer, hit Control I to invert that. That's going to be probably too strong, but we can kind of play with this in Blender and see what that's doing. I don't actually want to raise every section. So I'm actually going to go in here with a mask. So we'll create a layer mask there. And then I'll jump in here and start painting out some of these areas that are a little too faint and they don't really need to be erased. So let's take a brush here like this one. And using just black and white over here, it's already a white map. So painting with black, I can start painting out areas that I don't feel like need to be raised up. So the whitest areas I'll keep around because those are the darker values on the map that I think need to kind of be up off the page. And then everything that's a little bit faint, we kind of need to decide whether or not that needs to come up. And so for some of this, maybe it can stay, but some of the fainter stuff probably needs to go. And so we'll just play a little bit with pulling that out. This stuff down here, really don't want a ton of raised edges there. So I'm going to make that really subtle. And then over here, do the same sort of thing with these dotted areas and some of these outer regions. Don't need to have those really coming that much off the page. And you'll just find out with experimentation kind of what you need to do with these and what you don't need to do with these as far as how raised they should be. So very lightly brushing the page there to kind of take that down a little bit. And let's start with this. Now we can do any of the image tweaks we need to in Blender as far as the light and dark values using the color ramp node. And so if you want to save a little bit of memory, it's better to do it here. But that is possible to tweak on the fly. So for testing purposes, at least, it's not a bad idea to kind of play with that. So now we're going to save a separate image map. And this is going to be journal dirt, and we'll call this bump. Let that save. And then go back and play. Okay, so that's saved. So now let's duplicate our image node here. Let's get rid of that image map and pick our dirt bump that we just painted on. And we already have a displacement area down here. So I'm just going to grab this node, drop it somewhere into this displacement area. And now it's kind of tethered to this, this grouped area down here. And so we want to just kind of add on top of what's already there. So if I look at the preview here, we're going to start looking at the black and white map for our displacement. Now this is currently showing you kind of the wrinkles that are on the page. And what we want to do is add the caked up mud and dirt on top of that. So we'll go ahead and grab a, this is a color, which node is this? This is a color mix RGB node. In this case, we're going to add this on top. And so there's a couple of ways we can do this. One is to add with the existing node here and this here, we could turn the factor all the way up to 1. So if we preview this, you can kind of see what that's doing. Now that's going to kind of wreck the rest of the height values that we already have there. We can overlay, but if you notice what that's doing is it's kind of darkening all the values. And so maybe a better way to do this would be to plug this color input into the factor and then pick a value for our height here. And so we'll take the existing, put that in the left. In this case, we'll say we want the dirt to be pure white. So put that over there, and then we'll choose mix. So you can see what that's doing. Now, this would be the proper way to do this, but we probably need to play with the color ramp here to try to get a black and white map out of this. So we can start by bringing this in until we hit an area it's pretty much black, and that will only let the mud areas show through. Then if we were to preview this, you can see it's actually going down on top of what's already sitting there. And so it's not really changing those values on the outside edge at all. Now, the problem with this is that it's going to be using only white to represent the raised areas. So it's going to give us a pretty uniform looking, caked up mud, which has not got any height value. So that may not be what we want, but let's preview this and see what this looks like. Okay, so we're gonna have to get a little closer here. See what that's doing. Let this clear up a little bit, and it should show us a little bit of bump here. So I'm not seeing tons. Let's pull back our black and white depth over here. So we got a little bit more of that going on. Get more of that edges kind of coming out there. And then let's play with the mix a little bit here. So we could plug in our original bump map into this color here, and that will give us a more accurate value map for the height. Let's see what that looks like. Might even be able to bump this value up above 1 in terms of the white value, make it 2. See if that helps any. It's kind of a cheat there. Okay, I'm going to move around a little bit so I can see more of this dirt area. Okay, I'll let that clean up a little bit. Okay, so maybe to help preview what this looks like a little bit more, we need to actually have some gloss on this. So just to get started, I'm going to switch this over to a glossy shader instead of a diffuse shader. And the roughness should be up pretty high. Okay, that's glass, not gloss. There we go. Put the roughness up there. Okay, let's play a little bit more with the way this is being mixed. So what might be going on to get started with the way this is happening is these two values may be even a little too close together. So let's start by taking a look at this map. And just so we don't have to mess with any of this stuff in terms of breaking what's already there, I'm going to take the color ramp node here and preview these. I'm going to lower the input we get from here quite a bit. So let's take the white value down to, say, something like this. So see how much darker that gets there. And then when we add this back in with this on top, it's going to have a really dramatic effect there. So let's see if that's helping a little bit. Okay, I think it might be, but it might be. Yeah, we'll have to play with this and just see what's going on. Let's take this up a little more towards the middle. Kind of expand that map a little bit. Continue to do that. Let's see how far out this goes. Okay. Might want to do the same thing with our alpha here. So we can drive that up a little bit. So I'm going to grab the same sort of color ramp here. And if you want to kind of break out a node that's already trapped inside of a frame, if you hit Alt-P, that will let you do that. So if you drop it in, you can use the same commands you would to join and separate objects in the 3D viewport. Okay, there we go. That's helping us out now. Okay, so let's preview what this looks like and really kind of pull this back. So the black values are going to be transparent, white values are going to be opaque. So that's kind of interesting there. Okay. Want it to be a little more subtle than that, so I'm going to pull this back a bit. Didn't take much. Okay. So we've got a pretty good handle on our mapping here. Let's replug this back in with the original and kind of see what that looks like. Okay, let's play with this again. Okay, so we got quite a bit of bump going on there. I'm gonna pull back a little bit and take a look at some of these other areas. See how that's looking. So I think it's kind of doing what we want it to do. One of the other things we could play with, if the displacement isn't really doing it for us, is playing with the normal values a little bit. Now, the way this is kind of working, I'm not sure we're going to be able to mix the two systems together, but this is another option. So just so you guys know how to set this up, let's go ahead and play with that a little bit. So if we have our texture here, go ahead and pull this out so it's a separate piece. This is our displacement texture, dirt bump. So we need to add in a normal map node here. So actually, we actually need to add a bump map. So normal map would be if you're going to plug an already existing normal map into the scene, you'd use this. In this case, we need to actually use bump instead because we're going to generate one. So we'll throw the color into the height right here. And then let's preview what this looks like. Okay, so you can see what that's doing. That's more like what I wanted in terms of the intensity. So let's drop this down quite a bit. And then we can plug this straight into the normal for our glossy and kind of see what that's doing. Okay, so I can see a little bit going on here in terms of how this is being raised up. We're going to crank this up a lot. You'd be able to see more deformation happening, and you can see it on these edges kind of popping through. But not all of these areas are going to be sort of colored with that dirt. And so this is where we need to sort of tame this down a little bit so that it is working the way we need it to. So let's add in our trusty and faithful color ramp here, and then kind of see where we need to go to get this going. So if we were to just look at the black and white of our bump here, what we need to do is pull this in until we just have the areas highlighted that are kind of isolating this out for our dirt here. Now, this is going to make the bump very strong. So if we were to preview this now, you can see how insane that is. And so we'll need to pull the strength down quite a bit. The other thing we can do, since we want to keep the tops of these leveled out, is actually fix it in the color ramp. So we can bring the actual image map down a little bit. That will help. But it's kind of doing the same thing. So let's play with these values and see if we can get a happy medium here. So maybe we can raise this, lower that. Don't want to go too high because we're going to not get those caps in there like that. Okay, yeah, that's working a little better in terms of how that's coming off the page. And it looks like it's still working with the rest of our paper. So let me check the displacement for our page. And let's see if those wrinkles are still there. So as this is sort of cleaning up, it looks like those wrinkles are still active. So mixing the normal in there did actually help in this case. So there you go. You can kind of see that bump effect being added in by our map here. The preview of those normals right there. Okay, so in this case, maybe we switch the glossy back to a sort of diffuse. Let's bring that roughness back up to something pretty high. That doesn't have a lot of reflectivity there. And let's preview this again. Okay, yeah, it's feeling a little better in terms of how that's coming off the page. So if we don't feel like any of this stuff in here needs to be there in terms of this caking in and all of that, because there's really not a lot of dirt there, then I think the best thing to do in this particular case would be to go back to the image map and sort of paint that out. So let's lower our brush size here. Take this stuff out. So now I'm really going to go to town and kind of define what areas should be raised and what areas shouldn't be raised, so that we're getting rid of all these subtle gradations, and it's really showing us where that dirt is building up around those edges. So otherwise, we're going to have the paper feel sort of like it's randomly being raised without any explanation, and we don't want that. Okay, so any of those areas on the outside edges that have that sort of canvas type of effect going on, we can get rid of that stuff. Most of this needs to be gone, or at least taken down to a very, very subtle kind of level. And let's say the same thing goes for this stuff. Okay. Now, unfortunately, these areas are off the render page, so we're not really going to be able to see those unless we were to jump into the 3D viewport and take a look at that. But what we can also correct here is our bump map. So what I mean by that is if we look at Blender, we had to make some corrections here with our color ramp. And what we did was we ended up darkening this so that it was basically a pure black and white. And so what I'm going to do is lose that. And then let's jump back into Photoshop. And instead, let's make our layer black in the background. It's going to show us some more areas that probably need to be gotten rid of. Okay. So just going to kind of show the stuff that's needs to be visible. Okay, call that good. And let's go ahead and resave this map. Okay. All right, now let's reload this in Blender, Alt-R. And then I'm going to re-enable the preview here, turning it off and on so we can see what that looks like. And there we go. So now if we look at our bump, we've got a much sharper edge on that raised part. And we can kind of drop this a little bit so it's not so intense. And take a look here. And there you go. This is exactly the sort of effect we're looking for, a little bit more caked on, and that's one of those things probably a little too high still. So we'll drop that down even further until we get it down to a really subtle sort of level. It just needs to be high enough that you can kind of feel that it's, you know, raised a little bit there. And then we can also play with the alpha, lose those edges a little more there, something like that. And there you go. That's all you gotta do to get some mud thrown in the image. So there's a lot more we can do to this page. So that's the way to do mud. We can also go ahead and start adding in mold and fingerprints and dust and all sorts of stuff. So the question really at this point in time is, what is our story dictating? And you'll hear me talk about this a lot when we have a course on this 3D illustration stuff. But when we are talking about telling a story, everything about the background and the idea for it and everything plays into decisions you need to make as you're working on your scenes. And so let me pull open the test render from tonight in Photoshop so we can kind of look at this. And so the real question here is should we add dirt and dust more than this to the journal page? You know, we can make an argument for coming in here and spending some more time breaking up these wrinkles so they're not so kind of uniform on the page. But if the idea is a guy has sat down and he's kind of writing something, maybe he's not writing in the journal, but maybe he's writing on this map, something like that. Maybe he's sending a letter or he's about to start writing or something, we don't know. But we want to think that through and kind of have a game plan, right? And so you can see the ink has kind of dropped and started to land on the maps down here. And so one of the things we need to kind of look at is the other objects around the scene and how do they need to be aged? How do they need to be weathered? And if we look at what we did last night, we've got some of this sort of opaque, translucent kind of dust happening on this amber object over here. Really kind of makes this feel like it's caked on there and dried. And so we could add some fingerprints and things like that into there. Obviously, there's a lot more we can do to the desk here in terms of scratching it up. And let me go ahead and show you another way to paint these displacement maps in Blender. So let's get started by taking a look at how I did that. So if I select my leather object here for the desk, we can see that if we look at the node setup, we've basically got a diffuse material, glossy material, and then basic Fresnel blending into there. And then I'm driving the sort of color of the desk using this color ramp. and that's being driven by the same texture we're using to kind of add a little bit of noise and things like that. But I'm also using this image texture here to do some interesting things with the way that we're creating this displacement. So let's see right here, it's got this layer selected. So if I split this window, jump over to the UV image editor, let's get rid of this and select our layer here. And you can kind of see what it's doing. So if I jump into UV mode, so you can take a look at the desk here, everything on this left side is the tabletop surface. And so we're looking at it sort of sideways here, but in here is where the sugar bowl is sitting. And then over here is where the coins are and the money and stuff like that. And then you can kind of start seeing the outline of the journal here with the black and white. And so I did this using a plugin that I've just started picking up in Blender called bPainter. And so this is really kind of cool. I'll go ahead and hide that, collapse that down, and kind of show you how we would go ahead and add some more wrinkles to this. So I'm going to quickly save and then kind of expand this a little bit. Now with this selected, I'm on the right material. I want to make sure that I'm on the right image. So I have this layer selected, and then I have this selected in the image editor as well. And what I want to do is make sure I have my bPainter plugin turned on. So if I just type in Painter, you see that I've got bPainter right here. And so this is a really cool plugin. You can get it from Blender Market, and it helps you kind of get your textures in order. And it's a little bit more intuitive to use than the Blender's default painting. So what you need to do is you can add layers and things like that, but you just pick your object and click Start Painting. And you need to go ahead and make sure you have the right things selected as far as the image that you're going to be using. And so in this case, I'm going to clear out what is there for the image editor. And then let's go ahead and make sure we have the same thing selected as before. Layer there. And let's kind of take a look at some of these options here. So here you've got your brushes, and there's a lot of same sort of things you'd find in Photoshop in terms of hard and soft brushes, eraser, blur, smudge, things like that. And what's great about this is there's not really any built-in blurring and smudging and stuff like that in Blender. And so this will help you do sort of more interesting things like this. It's a little easier to use. So in this case, we need to make sure we have the right texture map selected. So jump down here and select this layer here. And you can see I've already got a couple of different images going here. This is a leather texture that I was working on. And then this is our layer that is connected up here in our node editor. So once that is selected, you've got the ability to kind of add more layers and things like that. But when you create this and select Start Painting, it's going to create a node up here that you can then connect into the rest of your scene. So I actually got rid of that before, and I'm actually just using the image connection. But we can jump in here with the default brush, make sure we're on the right color that we want to use. And if you hold Alt and left click and drag, you can color pick from here, which is kind of cool. So let's say we want to start painting with sort of white color over here. And it's kind of looking a little bit bland in this area in terms of the way that these are kind of layering in those wrinkles. And so we want to kind of play with that a little bit. So we'll pick our soft brush, and then we can pick the size and choose whether or not we want our tablet to affect that there, just the same way as we do with our sculpting. I'm going to change the brush mode to add in this case. So we're going to lower the opacity down quite a bit, and then we're just going to subtly start stroking in some things over here. So you can see how easy that is in the 3D viewport to kind of play with adding that stuff in. And the more subtle you want to be, you can. And then if you hit X, this is a really quick way to remove paint as well. And so in this case, instead of using add, we would want to use mix. But this is an easy way to kind of add in some variation. And this is basically what I did to create all of these sort of wrinkles that you're seeing on these areas of the render. So if we look at that in Photoshop, you can kind of see how those are raising up on these edges. And that's all that was necessary to create those and add those in. And we use the exact same technique we just went over for adding this layer dirt right here to kind of add those into the displacement layer and make those raised up and down. But you can do a lot of cool effects. I'm adding a little bit of wrinkles here. You can, add scratches and all sorts of stuff. And what's great is if you don't have substance, you can start by getting BPainter, which isn't really that expensive, and just work on your stuff here until you get comfortable, and then maybe at some point down the road jump into substance when you're ready to tackle PBR or something like that. So yeah. Pretty cool. I need to get in here and play a lot more with BPainter and kind of see what it can all do. But what's great that I really like here is this smudge tool. So you can see how quickly it is to kind of start playing with wrinkles and smearing things around. You can lower the strength here a little bit. So it's fun to just get in here when you got this active and just kind of play around with how that's working. And you can start by just adding in some contrast and then smudge them together. And it doesn't take a lot of value here to get some subtle reflections happening in your render, which I really, really like. And what I kind of did here was I started to kind of outline where a coin might have been laying. And so if we want to do the same thing around another one of these coins, maybe here, is we can just start by sweeping in from this black area and outlining this so that it's sort of darker in the middle and then a little brighter on the edges. And then all you would need to do is kind of go in with your brush here, lower this down quite a bit, and then just start adding faint lines in here that represent the outline of this coin. And anything that's getting a little too hard, we just smear away. And I love this a lot because I won't have to jump into Photoshop or another program and keep it all here. And, the tools aren't as robust, but honestly, a lot of times all you really need are these basic things to kind of get things mapped into place. And so it's really about how you use the tools that are kind of available to get going. So there you go, kind of see what that's looking like. So let's preview what this sort of render area would look like. So kind of rearrange my windows here again. Let's preview this image texture, start rendering this. Okay, so that did update, so we don't have to, resave or anything like that in terms of this image. So this is all internal, and now we can take a look at how this is rendering, and you can kind of see a faint little bit of highlight popping up around this, which is indicating that it's kind of raising around those edges. And what's great is once you've got your values mapped in for those wrinkles on the surface in terms of how light and dark you need to be, then you can just color pick from around the image itself, and you won't really have to worry about dialing those back in, right? And so if we want this to be even more raised, let's say that's not enough for us. Let's go back in here. Let's grab our white color. And let's really get in here and play with dialing this in. So we zoom in enough, you'll start seeing some pixelation happen where the texture reaches its limit, but that's normal. So we could even start coming off the edges a little bit, creating some interesting things here. I don't know if I really want that sort of thing to happen, but let's smudge this away. There we go. Then I really want to emphasize the brightness of this around here, because the bigger wrinkles in the image are more white than just gray. And so we really kind of need to punch that up. So this penny right here is kind of tilted, and it's maybe digging in a little bit on that edge. So if we do that, kind of see how that is raised up there. So once again, let's just make sure that that's all updating. It looks like it is there and there. So let's reposition our render. Take a look again. So yeah, there we go. Got some more defined wrinkles there. And we'll probably need to smudge the edges a little bit more to make it less, you know, like these are, you know, big heavy rocks digging into some leather. But, you know, that's kind of the idea. So let's go ahead real fast and clean this up a little bit before we get too far gone. And in fact, I'm just going to, instead of smudging or anything like that, I'm just going to paint over with a darker value. And we'll do that fairly subtly. And just kind of get this knocked back down. And of course, the more random you can kind of be with your painting, the better things are going to kind of look. But it wouldn't take very long to get in here and kind of play with all of this stuff to make this look pretty dang good. So really make those a lot more subtle. But variation there is going to really help that out. Let's preview that again. Okay, it's pretty much gone. But obviously we'll have to dial that in and play with how that's looking. And once it cleans up a little bit more, you'll probably notice some more of that coming back. But yeah, so that's the idea. So anybody that's in the chat that wants to talk about kind of grunging things up in terms of textures tonight, let me know what you're thinking about, and we can kind of decide what to play with. We got about 45 minutes left, maybe 40 minutes to play. So I'm open to ideas. Just for reference, this is kind of what we're working on right now. So tonight is the 10th stream, believe it or not. So that's about 20 hours of this project that's so far uploaded to YouTube. If you want to go back and look at this project, you can kind of see the money there that we're working on. Did the spoon last night. Past 5 days, I've been working on getting the base materials for this stuff in. So you can see, talked about doing some mud tonight and adding some dirt layers onto that. Still have a few objects I need to model and get into place, but we got a lot of room to play with different things in this shot. So still quite a bit of work to do. So maybe we go back right now and we kind of add in some fingerprints or something on this object. Maybe that would be a little fun. So we'll use the same basic idea. Maybe we can do this in BPainter. So let me set this up real fast. Switch back to object mode, grab this. Need to see where we are. So last night I created this dust group. It's got that in there. And maybe we need to kind of play with that a little bit more to see where we want to go with this. So let's preview this real quick. Okay, so it's still fairly faint, which we had kind of talked about last night. And what we might want to do is play with how that's being mixed in here. So if we look at how this is kind of looking, let's go ahead and ungroup this right here so we can start tweaking this a little bit. Hey, Lauren, I see your question. Are these recordings on your website or only on YouTube? These are all on YouTube, so completely free if you want to go back and look at any part of this project, all the way from importing everything, starting lighting, and then texturing up until now. There's quite a bit of footage on my personal YouTube channel. So just search Brandon Hicks, H-I-X, on YouTube, and I should be on there. And you can subscribe and look at the past 10 streams, including tonight's. And all of my streams will be going up on YouTube, Twitch, and Picarto at 7 p.m. Central US time. So here's kind of what the dust shader looks like by itself. So if this thing was completely caked in dust, this is what it would look like. And so we kind of need to decide how translucent we wanted to make this. So if we're looking at this, if we turn this all the way up, we're going to get quite a bit of the multiply in here. So that if we look at this, black areas would be just this diffuse. There you go. Hey, Lauren, no problem. Thank you for checking out the stream tonight. And don't forget, tomorrow night I'll be on as well, 7 p.m. Central. So we're going to be painting in Photoshop a little bit more. All right, so if we just look at the translucent, you can kind of see what that looks like. And now we need to figure out how to dial this in a little bit. So we kind of mix these. Not sure how much that's kind of doing for us, but we'll play with this. This is the original amber without any kind of dust on it. This is it added in. And so what we're going to need to do is we paint an image map to affect this is we're going to need to add in some more nodes for BPainter to be affecting that. So I think I actually want this to be a little bit more intense. So let's take a look at this right here. Okay. This needs to be way up probably for the roughness value. Okay. So this is what's blending the dust into the model. So any of those darker areas are going to not have the dust showing, as we can see here. And then the brighter areas are obviously showing up there. So if we wanted to play with the displacement, you can see it's not affecting anything in terms of this dust. What we would need to do is kind of take this value map and also add it into this displacement. So our multiply here is currently, you can see what that's doing to the outside of this. This will need to go on top of that map. So let's take our color, let's do a mix RGB. We're gonna plug the existing into factor here, and then let's go ahead and plug our current map for the dust into the let's do the color output 2, and we can play with how to add this in. So actually, let's go here and see another way to do this. Okay, so remember, we're starting with a value that is really dark, right? So these white and dark specks are basically just adding a little bit of surface bump on that that fossil. And what we want to do now is on top of that, add that dust in. So we're going to kind of do what we did before. And the difference is we don't want to lose all that stuff behind there. So we're going to cover it up in the areas that are dusty, right? But we definitely don't want to be covering up areas that aren't, right, with anything, because those need to be just the underlying fossil. So we're going to have to play a little bit with this map to get to where we need to be. So let's add in our color ramp here. And we're going to do that same sort of trick where we try to lock in our separation for the this map, right? So only the areas that are really contrasted and edgy are going to show up in the height map. So we can then plug this into the factor. Take a look at this. So the pink areas here would be the dusty areas. And in this case, let's now take this back down. And this is, remember, our height map. So it needs to come up off of the object enough to be noticed. So we'll do something like that and see what that's doing. So we should notice a little bit of differentiation here as we mix this in to the height map with our displacement. So with this map, now we need to add this into our existing and then replace into the displacement and see what this looks like. Okay. If we crank this up a lot, we should see a big difference in the height. And I'm going to get a lot closer here so we can actually see what this is doing. So you can see at this distance with this reflecting the lamp that's in our scene, how bumpy the surface sort of is on the fossil. And we're seeking to kind of cover this up with the dust. So let's go back to our map here. Okay, now that we've got that a little bit more contrasted. This is the noise texture that's driving the breakup of our dust on this object. So the more contrasted we make this, the sharper the fall off is going to be between dusty areas and non-dusty areas. And if we look at this, this is feeding into our multiply here. And going all the way back here, we can see what's being added into here for our bumpy surface, right? So there is that. Our bumps on the surface are there. All of this down here is dust, so we need to remember that. So this too will be lowered quite a bit there. And this bump is coming from this here. Take that down a little bit. And then let's kind of just reiterate back through and see what's happening. Okay, so we got our mix map here. Gonna make this even more intense. There you can kind of see what's happening with those edges. Just like that. So that's changing a little bit of how we see the dusts in our scene. Okay, I'll take that down there. And it's kind of what we do. We just kind of step through all of these nodes, double checking to make sure the values are where they need to be as we go, and kind of play. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the translucent. I'm not entirely sure that's doing much for us, and I think we can afford to lose it. I'm also not entirely sure we need to be pulling this bump right here. It's going into our diffuse, but I don't see that helping. So let's cut that. So we can definitely see a difference here with the way this is kind of being affected by our map. If we go back to yeah, there we go. Right here, it's better. Okay, so the color for our dust is actually coming from this shader right here. So let's play a little bit more with this. That's what I want. Brighten that up, make it seem a little bit more caked on there. So Lorian Davey asks, are you using a keyboard shortcut to initiate your renders? So over here, it is Shift-Z on the keyboard, or Shift-Z if you're from outside my country. And that will turn that on and off. And then if you're switching with the Node Wrangler add-on turned on, between these properties, you can hold Control Shift and left click on any of these nodes, and it will automatically add a little viewer node here, which previews on your object what this particular output looks like. So that will work on any output in Cycles. So yeah, that's better. So let's play again with the map a little bit more and kind of see how we can dial this in. Okay. So I want to give enough dust here that we can actually cut through it, maybe with like a fingerprint, or someone like drew something in the dust. So let's kind of pull back a little bit and take a look at that. Oh yeah, that's much better. Okay, so what we need to do now is paint a map on this that will help us do that in terms of cutting through there. Now the issue is going to be trying to do this, and now that I'm thinking about it, we don't actually have a UV map because this was created without any UVs, and it's basically just a subdivision surface object that has been completely torn apart by the sculpt tool, or in this case, I think we were using another method for that. So without a UV map, there's really not a good way to do this. We could do it with vertex color, so maybe try that. So let's go ahead and try that out and see what that will do for us. So I'm going to go ahead and add a vertex color map here. We'll call this dust map. Switch over into vertex paint mode. So in this case, I'm not really going to be using B Painter, I don't think. So I don't think there's going to be a way to do this. So let's jump back to our tools section. And if you don't have BPainter, this is how you would use the original Blender tools. So let's just select mix. Let's start with, this is already white, so we'll start with black. And then play with the stroke a little bit maybe. Turning on smooth stroke, which will give us the ability to kind of, paint with a lazy mouse sort of effect. So I want to kind of rotate into a position. Think about how somebody would be grabbing this, right? So if they're moving it around, they might just be grabbing it with these two fingers and like kind of shifting it. So perhaps there's a big area here where somebody's thumb went in and started playing around. So I'm actually going to turn smooth stroke off for here. And we'll just put the indication of like a thumbprint right here. So Lauren Davey asks, what does vertex mean? So a vertex is basically a part of a mesh, and a mesh is any of these objects that you see in the scene here. So if I were to zoom in on, let's say something simple like this pinning here, and then I tab into edit mode, you can see that I have these three buttons down here, and this is the vertex selection, this is the edge selection, and this is face selection. So with a polygonal mesh, you have vertices, edges, and faces, and those three things together make up a mesh. Faces are what make up the object. Those are made up of edges. So if you have spent any time learning geometry, you know what all this stuff is. And then, of course, those are made up of points, which we call vertices, or one vertex is a vertex. So vertex painting allows us to jump into an object, and then we can paint those vertices specific colors with a vertex color map, and then use that to drive things like textures or physics or anything you can think of in Blender. So it's a basic rundown. Cool thing about this is you don't have to have a UV map, which in this case means I don't have to retopo anything or spend all the time doing that. It only really works if you have objects that have enough vertices that you can paint and it won't be really blocky. In this case, I'm not really going to worry too much about it unless it just completely falls apart. But you can kind of see how this is going to work in our favor here, and decide whether or not it's going to happen, get away for us or not. Okay, so using black and white on mix, we can change how this is kind of being affected, and let's just call that good for now and see if this is working. Hey Lauren, you're welcome, no problem. Glad I can help. And thank you for watching the stream tonight. Okay. So to access the vertex color map that we just painted, what we need to do is add in an input. Go to vertex colors and select the dust map here. So this will show up for this object. And now we can use any of this stuff to affect our shader. So in this case, we want to use it to help affect how much dust is being driven into the fossil here. So I'm going to switch out of vertex paint mode. Just quickly switch back into rendered view and then preview what this looks like. So Lorian asks, are we applying smudges to the fossil right now? No, actually what I'm doing is I'm going to be trying to indicate where somebody might have put their thumb. And so it will, if that's what you mean, then yes, that's what I'm doing. But it should remove the dust where someone is picking the fossil up and kind of moving it around. So in this case, this is how we would do that. So if we look at our color output here, you can see what that's doing. And now we can just mix that over top of our dust map, and it will do the same thing that we see here. So maybe in this case, we want to have everything kind of covered in a little bit of dust as far as the map goes. Maybe not. Maybe instead we'll come down here. Play a little bit with that. And then right before we go into this mix node, yeah, right before we go into that, we want to add this in. So we're just going to basically throw one in the left channel, one in the right, and then we're going to multiply this on top. So this is a black and white map right here. Only the black areas will be added if we use multiply. So we preview that, you can kind of see what that's doing. And now it should remove these areas, so it's purely showing the amber material when we use that as a factor right here. Now, that's going to be how you would work on the displacement for that, right? So it's removing all of that there, but we still have the dust there, and that's because we haven't plugged that in for mixing the dust in on the mix shader up here. So we actually need to affect this map. So let's take the same idea and we will apply this over to here. So there we go, that's gone. That also means we need to increase the differentiation between the areas that have absolutely no dust and the areas that do. Now, if we look at this, yeah. So the areas that have a thumbprint and all of that, they are completely clean now. And then the areas that are still touched by dust, there you see, those are there. And that's been affected now in the dust itself and also on the displacement map. So you can see a little bit of a raised edge here. And if I zoom in, you can probably see this a little better. So I'm going to let this clean up a little bit in the render so you can see what this looks like. But it will define that edge where the dust starts, where the fingerprint kind of raked through that edge, and works pretty decently. So in this case, because we're just kind of using this as a map to drive something simple, like where a material starts and stops, it's on a transparent material, the dust isn't fully opaque, we can get away with using a low res, dust map that's a vertex color base. So it kind of does what it's supposed to do. And, you just have to play it by ear and decide what works and what doesn't. But in this case, it does work pretty well for us. Let's go down here and look at what this thumbprint looks like. So we got the corner of the maps coming up and kind of covering this up. You can kind of see what that looks like. So it's a little blocky, which we can play with. The best thing to do would probably be to go back in and create a retoppled object and then just project some normals and do it that way. But in this case, this is one way to do it, and kind of is a good starting point. We could also subdivide this again, but that's probably not a good idea considering how messy this is. So yeah, retopping would definitely be the best way to handle that, and something we might do later. But now we have a basic workflow down for how to cake that dust into there. So we have about 15 minutes left. Is there anything I can help you guys out with in the chat? Let me know. Really happy we got the spoon finished. Zooming in on this area, Control B will create in the 3D viewport your render region the same way as it does in your camera view. So if we start looking at this, you can see it from a bit of a different angle and just see how detailed that is. Really pleased with the way that turned out. And yeah, can't wait to get this rendered up full size in a poster and put it on my wall. So that's pretty cool. So there's quite a bit left to do as far as objects in the scene. Real quick, I'll go through and kind of show what we have left. Look at the concept art here. This is the amulet, which we haven't really modeled. At least I haven't gone back and remodeled it yet. I did an initial attempt and I'm not really happy with the results. So I'm gonna go back and kind of redo this. Shouldn't take that long. The only sculpted areas are really the carvings that are kind of in here. So it's not gonna be too difficult. The hardest part is the sapphire that's kind of in here. And so look at some of the sapphire test renders, which you guys might have seen on the Pinterest boards, but so this is kind of the material that we were working on for those. That's one of my first initial modeling attempts with normals and stuff like that. But yeah. So Lauren asks, when you say control, are you talking Windows control or Mac control? So on Windows, if we're talking about in Blender, Windows would be control, and on Mac it would be command, typically. I've used both, and I'll have to tell you, I'm pretty sure that's right. I haven't been on a Mac in a few months, but yeah, that is I think that's right. You can test it out pretty easily. You know, find a command that needs to have control on a Mac, and then try the command option or the command button or the control button and see which one works. But yeah, there we go. So let's see. Still got some materials to throw on, some patterns that are going to go on these cups and things like that. Those need to be taken care of. One of the things I wanted to do is kind of off kilter this cup object, because right now, if we just look at these objects kind of isolated, this is placed right in the middle of this ring, and it just feels like that's an opportunity to kind of push the illustration a little further and make it seem a little bit more realistic. So in this case, one of the things I would probably do is grab all the pieces that I want to play with right here, go into local view with / on the numpad. And then all of this is parented except for this object. So we'll just imported this. So we'll right click, shift right click this one, control P, and then parent the object, but keep the transform, which will keep everything in the same place in the scene. And then that way, when we move this around, all of these separate objects, the T and everything, are parented to this cup, which is then parented to the plate, which means that if I rotate the plate, everything moves with it, if that makes sense. So Lorian, don't worry about that. I'm here to answer all questions. No questions are stupid. And if you get value from this, then that's why I'm here. So yeah, thank you so much for stopping by. Okay, so what I want to do is kind of pull this over a little bit. So I'm going to go a little bit more towards where the sugar would be. And then I just want to rotate this and kind of make it a little bit more off kilter. So we got a lip here. So we'll need to bring this up. So where it's just sitting on top of that lip. And then, since it's kind of hovering at this point, zoom in here, need to clear the lip a little bit. So I can't see over the edge of this lip here from this plate. It's kind of in the way. So what I'm gonna do is hide the geometry so I can see past it. So if I hit Control+ on the keyboard, I can select more and more rows of edges till I get to the area that I want to be able to see. And then I can hide this. And if I'm in edit mode, that'll work. But the second I go back into object mode, it's going to unhide everything. So what I need to do is I can separate this out, make that a separate object real fast, and then hide that so I can see what I'm doing here. So you can see the teacup needs to be sitting on this lip here. Okay, so I'm going to drop it to where it's pretty close to being accurate. I'm going to drop my 3D cursor where it's kind of sitting on the ground there. And then if I jump into a side view here, what I want to do is tilt the teacup so that it's then sitting back on the ground on this side, because remember we moved it up. So I'm going to rotate around with the number 6 on my keypad until I get to sort of a side view here. And then I'm just going to rotate until I hit the ground, which I think is right about there. And there we go. It's just a little off, right? Little bit off kilter, but it works. And then we can just select that object and unhide it, reselect our plate, hit Control J to join those back up. And then because all of the vertices are sitting on top of each other, if we select the whole thing with A on the keyboard, go to W for our specials menu, or if we hit T to jump over to our palette over here, and then jump into this command here, remove doubles, or it's in the W right here under remove doubles, then it will join back up all those vertices that are sitting on top of each other and reconnect all of our plates pieces. So now it's one big object all over again. What's great about this is when we switch back out of local view, kind of feels a little bit more like somebody just haphazardly set it down and didn't line it up perfectly, right? You know, what's interesting about this is that the T would actually level itself off and kind of sit, you know, level with the ground. And so if we were to look at the T here, we would actually need to kind of move this area down so that it is level with our floor. Now, we can't really do that with this modifier still active because it's going to mirror what we do from side to side. If you can see how that's working there. But we can always go back and kind of tweak that later because realistically, that's kind of what it would do, is gravity would have an effect on that. So yeah, looks a little bit more off at this point in our preview. Kind of see how that looks. And what I like about this too is that the silhouette of our spoon is kind of passing over all of these little circular lines and then entering into the top of our sugar bowl here. And that visual overlap of layering in the image is one of those things in an illustration or drawing that can really add depth, right? And so that's something to be looking for, are those intersections and those tangents. Make sure that you're layering things in because it can really affect the vibe of your image here. But it just feels a little bit more natural, you know. This feels a little bit more interesting like that. And we may continue to move things around until we find some good things. So there actually is already transparency in the T, and it's more opaque at this point. In fact, I should just show you the Photoshop image. So you can see through, it's just very thick because it's got milk mixed into it. And so you can see the outline of the spoon here, just very, very dark. If we wanted to change that, we could. So let's say we're not happy with that. Let's grab the T. And the only thing that you need to do to switch this up is play with the roughness here for the glass. So if we were to turn the render back on, let that resolve a little bit, you can kind of see the light bouncing around a little bit inside of there. But you know, nothing needs to be completely transparent, even glass, because it's unrealistic. But let's say we want to make it half as much thick. We can turn that down to 0.05. And then really quickly, if I render this for you, should be able to see kind of how this looks. So I'll let this go for a minute. We're pretty much out of time, so this may be the last thing we get to do. But this will kind of make the tea a little bit less blurry and a little less thick. And you should see the spoon come through a little more now that we've turned that down a little bit. And there we go. With denoising turned on, it really just, you know, makes that process fast. So I like that. So in my opinion, like, you could do this. It's a little thinner in terms of being able to see details and stuff like that. But since we are adding milk into this tea, it would get more opaque and be less transparent as we go. And so it's just one of those things you have to balance out and kind of play with what works best for the scene. And I think going a little thicker than this is probably a good idea. But yeah, you can see the effect there. So it does have transparency. The light's coming in. You can see the cast shadow from the spoon down here and all of that. And this was actually a pretty simple material. It looks more impressive because the shadows are being cast from the milk being mixed in on top of the surface and things like that. But it's pretty much just a glass shader with some milk added in on top, so not too bad. But yeah, so maybe we split the difference and go up to something closer to this and kind of see how that looks. What would also probably happen with that milk getting mixed in for that is that you're going to see the milk is going to mix in and make the tea a little bit less saturated and probably even brighten it up a little bit. So subtle change there, and we should see a bit of a difference here in our glass material for the tea. What we can also do to kind of get that milk mixed in even a little further is to play with the mapping here. So this is our map for our milk being added in. And obviously the areas that are white are getting that milk added in more. But if we want to mix in even more milk, we can drop these down and pull that in even further. Just like that. So now when we preview, we should see even more kind of mixed in on top. Can pull this up a little bit so it's not pure black. This is also driving the color for our milk here. And so as it mixes in towards the edges, we made it a little bit more creamy. So we might take, again, the saturation down a little bit. Just kind of play with how that's working there. Kind of preview that. So there you go. It's a little bit more frothy down on top. And yeah, it's just a give and take until you hit something that you're happy with. And I would encourage you guys, if you're interested in cycles, to just get in here and play with the node setups. Once you understand the basics in terms of, you know, mixing a Fresnel value into an object and how basic transparency and things like that work with bouncing light around in your scene, it's not too hard to get in here and play with the materials and kind of make some interesting looking things. So I'm actually going to leave that back up at 1. I like that a little better. But yeah, so that's going to do it for me tonight, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. And if you haven't checked it out, check out theorangeguild.com. That is where I have all my training courses up there. Several hours of in-depth training, much more polished, and will take you much faster through these processes if you go through the courses. It's $19 a month if you want to be a member. $200 for the full year, and you get unlimited access 24/7 to everything. In the description of tonight's stream, there will be a link. So check once it is uploaded to YouTube in an hour or so. There may be a recorded version of this that you can check out, and you'll be able to get your first month free for the Orange Guild. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. I appreciate you, and I'll see you tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Central Time. So hang in there. I'll see you. Thanks.